Question Time was highly charged. Some thought perhaps the most charged encounter between Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson that we've seen. Labour trying to turn the focus on to what it sees as the government's U-turns, the government trying to take some credit, secure some credit from voters for having got the schools open, having, albeit a zigzag course, they feel moved the country forward. But at least as interesting was what was said behind the scenes in Parliament today when the Chancellor and the Prime Minister went to address newly elected Tory MPs from the December general election, many of whom don't like the idea of tax rises that are being talked about. And the message, it was coded but not heavily coded, was brace yourselves, there will be tax rises. I think there's a widespread expectation that they won't be immediate tax rises announced in the autumn. The government doesn't want to take on taxes that it is pledged not to touch, like income tax. That leaves you looking at things like property taxes and pension taxes, areas like that often take consultation, take longer anyway, even if the Chancellor wanted to touch them early, which he probably doesn't. But tax rises coming seemed to be one of the big messages in what was just the second day back of Parliament after the recess. In their first exchanges since the summer break,
a huge policy reversal.
The Labour leader accused the Prime Minister
forced the U-turn,
of having presided over a string of U-turns.
Another U-turn.
A summer of chaos.
This has been a wasted summer. The government should have spent it preparing for the autumn and winter. Instead, they've lurched from crisis to crisis, U-turn to U-turn. To correct one error, even two might make sense. But when the government's notched up 12 U-turns and rising, the only conclusion is serial incompetence. That serial incompetence is holding Britain back. Will the Prime Minister take responsibility and finally get a grip?
Mr. Speaker, I take full responsibility for everything that has happened under this government throughout my period in office. And actually what has happened so far is that we have succeeded in turning the tide of this pandemic. And in spite of the negativity and the constant sniping from the opposition, we are seeing a country that is not only going back to school, but going back to work.
Defending his actions on the exams U-turn, the Prime Minister said he'd trusted Ofqual, who said their grade prediction algorithm was robust. Moments earlier, speaking to MPs, Ofqual's chairman said the government had plumped for the worst of three options Ofqual put in front of them.
At the outset, our initial advice to the Secretary of State was that the best way to handle this was to try to hold exams in a socially distanced manner, that our second option was to delay exams, but the third option, if neither of these was acceptable, would be to have to try and look at some form of calculated grade. It was the Secretary of State who then subsequently took the decision and announced, without further consultation with Ofqual, that exams were to be cancelled and that a system of calculated grades was to be implemented.
Back in the Commons, the Prime Minister tried to refocus the exchanges on Keir Starmer's past support for Jeremy Corbyn.
This is a leader of the opposition who supported an IRA condoning a politician who wanted to get out of NATO.
Mr. Speaker, before I go on, the Prime Minister said something about the IRA, and I want him to take it back. I worked in Northern Ireland for 5 years with the police services of Northern Ireland, bringing peace. I prosecuted the Director of Public Prosecution, serious terrorists, for 5 years, working with the intelligence and security forces and with the police in Northern Ireland. Asked the Prime Minister to have the decency to withdraw that comment.
He didn't withdraw it, and just as the Labour leader got up to ask his final sixth permitted question, the Department of Health announced what Labour said was another U-turn. Lockdown restrictions in Bolton and Trafford would stay in place after all. Number 10 said it was no U-turn. The Prime Minister left to address in private some of the 109 new Tory MPs he first welcomed to Parliament back in December after his general election victory.
Unite, level up. Is anybody listening to this?
Today, they heard a very different message. I know it's been tough, he said. I've got to warn you, it's about to get tougher. The waters are about to get choppier. The Chancellor addressed the same group after a week of Tory MPs trying to head off tax rises. His speaking notes, snapped on the way to the Commons, talked of having to do difficult things, code for tax rises, but went on, this does not mean a horror show of tax rises with no end in sight. He was asked afterwards what exactly that meant.
I think everyone understands we can't carry on doing exactly what we did this year forever. So over time, we need sustainable public finances. That's a responsible and right thing to do. But in the short term, what we're focused on is protecting and supporting jobs. And that's what the Kickstart scheme today is all about.
One more question.
You're finished, mate, sorry.
Well, I ask you, what does a horror show of tax rises with no end in sight mean?
Dan, we're done. Thank you.
With the economy fragile, few think the Chancellor will risk major tax rises this autumn. But the Treasury is exploring what tax levers it'll pull in future budgets to pay for the huge and still growing costs of the COVID crisis.
Well, plans to ease local lockdown restrictions in Bolton and Trafford have been abruptly scrapped after a spike in coronavirus cases. Local council leaders had begged the Westminster government to keep the measures ongoing, while the Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham said that central government attempts to impose decisions on communities were confusing people, causing anger and resentment. Now, across the UK, another 10 coronavirus deaths have been recorded, taking the total to 41,514, and a further 1,508 new cases have also been confirmed. Our North of England correspondent Claire Fallon is in Bolton now. Claire.
Well, Matt, you might think that if people are expected to stick to the rules in their area, then they probably need to know what those rules are at any given time. But it has been a bizarre 24 hours because last night here in Bolton and also in Trafford, the local councils were strongly arguing for their local lockdowns to remain in place beyond midnight when they were due to come to an end because of a sudden spike in the number of cases. So here in Bolton, we currently have one of the highest rates of infection in England. But move ahead to just after midday today, and the government said that the local lockdowns in Bolton and Trafford would be continued. And yet, everyone I've spoken to here today is under the impression that they did end at midnight, and so that decision meant that the lockdowns were reimposed. But the government saying that actually the decision was paused. And yet, Trafford Council, who I've spoken to a few minutes ago, they're saying this evening that, frankly, if that were the case, that would mean the law changing in the middle of the day, which would be odd and confusing. But confusion, frankly, has been the theme all the way through this today. We started the day on the border, and this morning at least, a divide between two sets of rules.
So they've changed it again? Right, so I don't think anybody knows, do they?
Does anyone have a clue right now?
Don't think so. No.
I don't get it myself. I'm just as lost as you are, to be honest.
Salford still under local lockdown. Bolton unlocked at midnight. A change questioned and challenged repeatedly because of Bolton's high and rising infection rate. And so this afternoon, the about turn was swift, if not surprising. Do you mind me just asking you what your understanding is of what the lockdown or not lockdown rules are at the moment?
For Bolton, don't have a clue.
Both key workers, we met Jade and Lucy this morning after the unlock, but before the relock.
It's just very mixed messages, very contradicting. It's, you know, one minute you can go and see somebody in a pub, next minute you can't go to your parents and see your parents. It is very mixed messages.
Where do your parents live?
Farnworth.
So you can go and see them as of today?
As for today I can.
But not tonight, with tighter rules back again in Bolton and Trafford. A month ago, both areas went into a local lockdown with the rest of Greater Manchester. As their infection rates fell, they were told to unlock ahead of other places. But over the weekend, numbers went back up quickly, and both council leaders asked the government to leave the tighter rules in place. But the unlock went ahead. And so this morning, the Mayor of Greater Manchester asked the 500,000 people living in Trafford and Bolton to keep sticking to lockdown rules, even though they weren't officially the rules anymore.
I think this day needs to mark a kind of line, if you like, in terms of the way the government has been running things today. National government sitting in Whitehall imposing decisions on local communities has got to stop. We can't have that anymore. It isn't working, it's confusing people, it's causing anger and resentment.
At the market inn, Charlie told me she sees the anger and frustration. You must have a battle trying to explain to some people what they can and can't do.
I know, it is really hard. Some people don't really listen.
People been rude?
Yeah, some people are rude.
At this point, it was just after midday. Oh, you were great.
I'll just keep you there for a minute. Government have backtracked.
Oh!
So...
I just don't know how you run a business and keep on top of the rules when they're shifting all the time.
I know. Scary as well. I don't really want to catch the virus or...
Well, the measures were due to be lifted today, and we took the decision that they aren't going to be lifted in Bolton and in Trafford because the number of cases has gone right up, and we took that swift and decisive action, having seen in the last few days the number of cases of coronavirus almost double.
And so, 12 hours and 11 minutes after having their restrictions lifted, Bolton and Trafford are back in local lockdown again. Matt Hancock says it's about taking swift and decisive action. It's not exactly how it feels to people who live here.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Mayor of Greater Manchester, who you saw in Claire's piece, Andy Burnham, and to Dr. David Nabarro, who's a special envoy on the pandemic to the World Health Organization. I put it to Mr. Burnham that he'd called for the easing of restrictions 2 weeks ago. Had he also got it wrong?
I called for the easing in respect of Wigan because the cases were very low there. I agreed with Bolton last week, where the leader said he wanted to ask for easing because the cases were low last week, but there's been a dramatic change in the last 7 days. So hence I supported the change that we asked for the government to make yesterday. But with Trafford, we all agreed last week that they shouldn't have restrictions eased. And that was the specific request that the council in Greater Manchester put into the government. And I'm sorry to say it was completely ignored. And that explains, certainly from a Trafford point of view, why we've ended up in this mess today, where the government, in a Whitehall knows best way, just overruling, ignoring the views of local councils. Really not acceptable.
But do you give the government credit for responding to a fast-moving situation, or has it just sown confusion on the ground?
It's sown confusion. I was in touch with them yesterday to say that this was coming and we needed an answer because, you know, it's not me who's making the decisions. It's the leaders of the councils in Bolton and Trafford who were the prime decision makers. And they both were clear yesterday that they didn't want restrictions lifted because of the change in the cases in both boroughs.
David Nabarro, do you sympathise with Andy Burnham's position, and do you think that local lockdown decisions should be made on the ground?
Certainly, all the evidence that we have from all over the world suggests that decisions do have to be made locally using information that helps us understand how the virus is moving.
So is test and trace still the key, and is test and trace still not up to scratch in the UK?
So let's be clear on this. You can't go on having lockdowns for the long term. They're a way of slowing the spread of the virus, but the way you stop the virus in its tracks is by identifying people with the disease, isolating them, finding their contacts and isolating them. It works remarkably well. We mustn't imagine that the virus is going to suddenly get bored and go away. Actually, it thrives when we get bored, so we have to keep on the alert and be on the defensive all the time.
Andy Burnham, you've called for more resources to enable test and trace to perform better locally, door-to-door contact tracing, basically. Are you getting resources from the government? How much are you talking about?
Not yet, but I couldn't agree more with David Nabarro. That is very much the united Greater Manchester view, expressed by all of our leaders, both Conservative and Labour. We need an exit route from these restrictions, and it is about a much more effective test and trace operation. The national system, Cathy, simply is not working for us. Councils need to be the primary decision makers here as to whether or not they ask the government for restrictions.
David Nabarro, you've said the virus isn't going to get bored and go away. But if you look at the death rate in Spain, for example, they're saying that the death rate there is now as low as 0.3%. Should we actually be worrying a whole lot less about coronavirus and treating it more like flu?
Well, I wish that we could say that these figures suggest that the virus has suddenly lost its bite. The virus is still nasty. What we're seeing is that a lot of younger people are getting the disease and they tend not to die. But don't forget that actually this disease is much nastier than we often think it is. There are many people who are getting COVID who are young adults who are finding that after 100 days, they're still not able to go back to exercising. About 5% of people get what we call long COVID, and it's not nice. So please don't let's get the word around that this is a mild condition. This is a really serious virus, which can have long-term debilitating effects, as well as killing people. I'm just really glad it's not killing so many.
Andy Burnham, I noticed you said you were going to go back to work in the office. Are you worried that now we've got this all out of kilter, that actually the economy's being trashed, and actually now there are 10 times more deaths from flu in England and Wales than from COVID? Have we got it all out of kilter?
Well, Kathy, people do need to return to school and also to the office because we can't stay under restrictions. It might not be the message your listeners want, your viewers want to hear tonight, but we're actually about to enter the most difficult phase of this crisis. And we still do not have test and trace working properly. And that's why these blanket restrictions are needed, because test and trace isn't working.
David, one final question to you. Are we now in a second wave in many parts of Europe, or are we heading for it very soon?
I try not to use that language. This is not a virus that comes in waves. It's a virus that's just around in the community everywhere. And what matters is having the defences in place to stop it building up again and again with spikes and surges. We will get more surges if we can't get the defences in place. Whether you call it a second wave or a resurgence or just whatever other language you want to use, we've got to stop it.
David Nabarro, Andy Burnham, thanks very much.
Thank you, Kathy.